on a Harbinger.
Yeah, I was gonna
Like
say
it's
that's got to be Harbinger only.
Yeah, Harbinger is basically the only place in the United States other than the Ebon Hawk where you can get pub side progression rating. It's insane. Like everybody is PvE rating on the imp side now. Maybe just everyone wants to be Zors. I don't know.
Isn't that more a byproduct of, the Republic's guilds not sustaining themselves? I mean, so, or, you've got stronger leaders or more established guilds on the Imperial side, and so when Severity falls apart, for instance, it's very easy for Zors to absorb, half of them, because they didn't have an alternative to go anywhere else.
I would expect actually it has a lot to do with imbalances on servers, depending on which server you're on and everything. And obviously Harbinger has by far the largest Republic population. Beyond that, I wouldn't be surprised if maybe these numbers start to change a little bit now, as long as they live up to their promise. We've got 3.0 out, we've got 2 new operations, and they say they're going to actually never go over a year without a new operation again. If we start to see consistent content, we'll probably have a larger population that's actually engaging in the progression type operations because they don't have to go to another game to find more content.
Yeah, I think it's just a temporary imbalance right now, and it just things do kind of have a network effect. It's not quite as bad as so in PvP, right? Network effects, especially local to a server, can be really, really bad because if you're on a server where the Empire side always wins, well, if you queue on pub side, you're never going to be matched up with imps in your own team. You're always going to be against them or against pubs. So so that the Nash equilibrium is PvPers all get pushed to the same faction. PvEers, that sort of happens a little bit where you have network effects with guilds and whatnot, but at the same time, if one guild on your server is doing pub side progression and doing it seriously, that doesn't really hurt the guilds on your server who are doing imp side progression, and they don't hurt each other. So I think it's kind of a weird state right now, and I don't think it's going to stay this way.
I think what's interesting, looking at the only data that BioWare recently released about this with their infographic, it wouldn't confirm the imbalance, really. I mean, while it was slightly skewed for Imperial, it really was overall pretty balanced. But I think you guys on the podcast have discussed kind of the holes in that number anyway, in the numbers they released. But it's just, it would be really interesting to look at the actual data and say, these are the number of weekly clears or lockouts used for each faction on the server to get a sense of where the raiding activity is actually happening.
It's actually something I've been thinking about and trying to figure out what would be the best way to approach them so that they could give us numbers. And I think really it would be nice to know percentages. I don't need to know actual number of players per se, but the percentages would be great. And in that way they could say, oh yeah, there's still 7 million people playing the game every month. Fine, that's fine. Tell me the percentages at the end game, who's engaging in what, even in ranked PvP, which we can actually kind of glean some information from the leaderboards just because of imbalances. Okay, well, all scoundrels are probably healing if they're above a certain rating, But for the operations, fights, and clears, I'd like to know those numbers just based off of percentages, imps, pubs, or, those going into certain healers. And you would expect that they could actually give you genuine numbers about healers now that they've got this discipline system and there's no hybrids involved. So if they're in a discipline, they're in there as that discipline. But I think I think we are in a weird position. You guys have stated that very well. We're in a weird position, and really the next few months are going to give us a more realistic picture of what's going on with this game. So anyway, let's move in to what we're here to talk about, stats. And I guess we should go ahead and just... What did you point at theory crafting to answer questions? Did you want to go over that?
Yeah, so I guess I didn't know if this was going to be exclusive to stats. I thought it was an interesting opportunity to talk about theory crafting in general, because I think there's a perception, a misconception even by some people in the community that what number you come out with at the end of a spreadsheet is not right. Hey, I observed this in game, therefore that's got to be the right way to do it. And while that can be true under certain circumstances, it isn't necessarily always, and it isn't usually directionally correct for you. So I guess my theory, and be interested to hear Keyboard Ninja weigh in on it, is really theory crafting is aimed at answering questions where you can't get enough data, or experimenting is too difficult to do. whether it's there's too many factors for you to control in your experiment, or the difference between A and B is so small that you can't really see it in an experiment. So I think there's a lot of value in understanding what is happening with the math and what happens with the game mechanics that really should drive a lot of our gearing decisions or in how we play our tunes. More so than somebody spending 5 minutes on a dummy parse and concluding that they've mastered something.
Yeah, I can definitely echo that. I think so. Theory crafting, and to be more precise, right? We have to talk about exactly what sort of theory crafting we're doing here. And I think most of the time when Oofalong and I talk about theory crafting, we're talking about building stochastic models that use conditional probability to predict outcomes. So we know what crit chance is. We know how the RNG works in the game. We know what the base damage of abilities are. So we can predict that if you crit this amount of times and your surge is this amount, then you can take those together and do an expected value computation and get a result. Same thing with tanking, right? There's another form of theory crafting, or there's another form this can take, which has different advantages and disadvantages, which is simulation, right? Where you're basically writing a subset of the game engine in kind of a scripting form, and you script out these fights and these encounters that have assumptions about like what bosses are going to do and what players are going to do and what sort of downtimes and movement you might have. And you throw that all into one big bag and you shake it up and you run a fight 200,000 times. And then you look at the numbers you get out of the result of it, right? So simulation is sort of less smooth and less precise than the statistical model or the stochastic model, because the stochastic model is going to give you one number, definitively one number, and that number is usually the average. Whereas a simulation it has noise in it from random numbers and things like that, right? But simulating is still going to be more precise than one guy spending 5 minutes on a dummy in the game. And I think it's that precision and that sensitivity to tiny changes that is attractive about theory crafting. So a really good example in the current game is a lot of DPS specs are wondering, what is better, main stat augments or power augments? What is the answer? Well, a lot of people are trying to answer this by just sitting down on a dummy with 14 main stat augments. And they're like, oh, okay, well, I got this number. And okay, I parsed a couple of times and I got these sorts of numbers. All right, now I'm going to switch to power augments. Okay, I got these other more different numbers. Okay, well, this is better. Like that's not enough data. It's really not enough data. You would need to be parsing for hours and hours and hours to really, really see something that's sensitive. Because when we look at the math, when we look at models, these stochastic models that can predict things to very, very fine grains of accuracy, we see that the difference between them for most DPS classes is very, very, very small. And that tiny difference is more than overwhelmed by differences in crits between parses and even just tiny fluctuations in your latency, whether or not your hand muscles were a little bit tired. And so maybe you delayed an ability like twice. That's enough to overwhelm the difference between main stat and power augments. Theory crafting doesn't have that problem because theory crafting is always precise. And that's what's very attractive about it for answering a certain class of questions.
Yeah, I think you raised two good, interesting points there. The simulation, I think, is a great tool. One that we don't see a lot of use, I feel like, in Star Wars: The Old Republic. One of the biggest limitations I have with that is so if you want to build a model, you have to make certain assumptions. You have to be able to build something. You have to essentially do all of that work to create a simulation. And once you've created that simulation, most likely, it's effectively a black box. Nobody else can go in there and validate your assumptions or review what you've done and help you, debug it or find errors with it. Most of the modeling and theory crafting that goes on now is done in a public format where people can comment and say, hey, I think you're thinking about this the wrong way, or, you need to apply, the damage increase, happens before the ability crits or after it crits, actually. So, you need to consider that. So I think that's where some of this modeling is preferred to simulations. It's just my own personal bias there, maybe, but in the simulations that I have seen, oftentimes in talking to the people who develop them, they end up having some errors, some wrong assumptions that their simulation has told them something, and that's completely valid, but the input going in wasn't accurate. So it's tougher to trust the output, and there's not the 30 people reviewing it on the forums or looking at it publicly to help them detect that error. So I think that's one of the other big benefits of modeling over simulations. But sims definitely have their place. And
Yeah.
I think the
that's-
augmented. Oh, go ahead.
No. I was just gonna call out the review aspect of theory crafting really quickly, because I think that's a highly overlooked aspect of theory crafting and the community in general. But at the end of the day, peer review is really, really, really important. I can do all of the modeling that I do. Like I can do all of this completely in private. I can do this for my guild. I can give them their numbers. In fact, it would be a lot easier because then I wouldn't have to like format things on the forums and do fancy stuff and, you know, write extensive write-ups and then defend my views later when like 27 people say blah. But at the same time, I get much more accurate results if I can put it out there and have Dipstick and Thuxus and Oofalong and various people come at it and hammer at it and be like, no, you're wrong. You need to change this over here. Or, what's your justification for that thing? The wisdom of the community is much stronger than the wisdom of any one of us, and that's a really, 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 really vital aspect of theory crafting.
Well, I mean, I guess if you think about it, it's like writing a paper. Anybody can write a paper, but you need the editor to go through and make sure that you got all your conjugations right and your spelling's correct and everything else. And it's hard to edit your own work.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely your error. You know, because you're so close to it, maybe if you've made a mistake, it's tougher for you to see. And I know in at least some of this, you know, model spreadsheets that I've created, they're super complex. And even for me to go back and relook at it and be like when I was updating things for 3.0, I had to take a step back and be like, okay, well, what was I really trying to accomplish with this particular calculation? And is that the best way to do it? Maybe I should revisit this and make it cleaner or simpler then. And lots of fun things to play with there. I also wanted to comment then on the parsing. I see a lot of people that, you know, will parse, and in my experience of helping people review their parses that they would upload to TorParse or something like that, there's a small handful of people that are capable of getting good information out of parses. And as Keyboard Ninja mentioned, whether it's latency or I don't even think it's just latency. I think it's people not clicking as quickly. They're bad. Like, I'm not going to blame the computer. I'll blame the person at this point. That it's so difficult to have the exact same rotation with the exact same timing from parse to parse. And then I think one of the most interesting things to do, if you look at your overall crit rate for your what I'll call portfolios of abilities used, it probably is pretty close to your character's crit rate. But there's going to be wild variance from one ability to the next in terms of how often that crits. And so in one parse, if you have your biggest hitting abilities crit more often, you'll get a higher parse than when you have all of your little hitting abilities crit. And that is just something that people say, oh, I saw 150% DPS difference between power and primary stat, therefore X is better. And that's just patently wrong, because the difference is not 150 DPS, and they're just looking at the summary number and not diving into what's causing those differences and trying to understand that. So I'll throw out but I mean, parsing definitely has its place. There's a lot of value in it. I'll say at least my approach to parsing is about treating it as if it's a scientific experiment. You want to control variables. You want to normalize things. I always take off my crit or my proc relics when I'm doing any type of parsing, because that, by definition, is introducing some variance or volatility in what you're doing. And so if you're trying to test A versus B, you want to eliminate as many variables as possible, not introduce more. So some other fun things to think about.
Yeah, there's another variable, especially in DPS parsing, that is way too often overlooked, which is that, you know, if you hover over an ability and you look at the tooltip, most of the time that ability is going to have a min damage and a max damage. And people tend to forget that that's there, because they just think of like, oh, okay, more of the variance is going to come from crits. So, you know, if I have a parse that has good crits, that's just going to be way better than a parse that has bad crits. And, you know, a parse that has the same crit rate as another parse, you know, they're probably going to be about the same. And that's simply not the case. I have seen, I mean, I run the Ebon Hawk DPS leaderboard, and I have seen many, many parses where the crit rate was actually pretty stock average. Like, you didn't see anything crazy or something like that, but the DPS was simply off the charts. And it wasn't it wasn't because that person was executing that much better, because you can align like, okay, they had this many activations of this and this many activations of this, and they put things in this order and they had this kind of APM. Like you can align things up and you can see that, and you can see, oh, these two people are executing almost exactly the same. But this person got like, 300